How's it going, everybody? And welcome back to my hyperfixations. Today we're going to be talking about controllers, but not in like a what's the best controller, what's the weirdest controller, no. We're going to talk about something very specific, very granular that most people don't really care about, but is something that I find personally interesting. That's basically what this whole channel is. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between the PlayStation controller and the Xbox Series, the Xbox controller, specifically in how the controllers are laid out. What I find interesting about controllers nowadays is that generally we've come to a consensus on what the layout of a controller is and what it should be. You've got the 4 face buttons, 2 analog sticks, a D-pad, 2 bumpers, 2 triggers, and a start and select, and a home button. Oh, and both of the control sticks also click in like buttons as well. There may be additional buttons here and there for specific things that happen on specific consoles, but for the most part, that is the layout. That is what every controller has, and that's what most people see as a controller nowadays. And I'm not here to argue about which one is better and which one's worse, because ultimately that's going to be a personal preference. But it's interesting to sort of trace the lineage of these layouts and see like where everything began, basically. I think we'll start with the PlayStation controller since I know the most about this layout and its history and its origins and all of that fun stuff. So in case you're unaware of this for whatever reason, in case you haven't watched the thousands of video essays on the internet about this particular topic, Nintendo and Sony were originally going to develop an add-on for the Super Nintendo called the PlayStation. But to sum up a big long story, Nintendo publicly broke up with Sony basically, and then Sony went on to form a worldwide phenomenon, titan of the video game industry, purely out of spite. Now, I don't own an original PlayStation 1 controller, so you'll have to do with JPEGs and PNGs that I find online. So here is the PlayStation 1 controller. And you'll notice a very interesting thing about it is that it is lacking the dual analog sticks of the modern PlayStation layout. Usually what people think of when they think of a PlayStation controller, or at least a PlayStation 1 controller, is normally the DualShock. Even though it's not the first, it was technically the dual analog controller that was first before the DualShock. DualShock added rumble. It's a lineage of controllers, right? So initially you had the PlayStation 1 controller, which did not feature analog joysticks. Then you had the dual analog controller that came out later, which had the 2 sticks. Then you had the DualShock, which added rumble feature. But the interesting thing is that the original PlayStation controller over here released in 1994. The dual analog controller and the DualShock didn't release until 1997. Meaning for 3 whole years of the PlayStation 1's life, there were no analog sticks. Because you gotta remember, analog joysticks were a relatively radical idea at the time. Yeah, there were some controllers here and there that had analog joysticks, but those controllers mostly stayed in the PC gaming realm with things like flight sticks, and racing wheels also technically count as analog controllers. But the controller that really made a splash, that really showed people that analog controls are a big thing and they have to be in controllers moving forward, was the Nintendo 64 controller. Now this puppy was released in, let me look at my notes here, September 29th, 1996 here in the States. And I just want to be very clear with you, this is a modded controller. It's modded to be a wireless, PC-compatible controller. I have a video on this controller right now on this mod, so you can go and click that right now. This is not a stock N64 controller, just wanted to be clear on that one. So this controller releases in 96, and then in about half a year later, the DualShock controller releases, and those two are pioneers in their own rights. This one was the first one to actually have an analog joystick and have that be like a mainstay for a controller, but the DualShock was the first one to have 2 of them. And at the time, that was also a relatively radical idea. Back then, games were predominantly controlled with just a D-pad. Now, you can control a 3D game with just a D-pad. Who here has played Metroid Other M? Am I right, guys? Let's hear it up for Metroid Other M, everybody. But you weren't going to get the same level of fluid control as you would with an analog stick. So having one for 3D games just made sense. Having 2, though, well, that was a bit more interesting. And Sony did make use of those 2 control sticks right out of the gate. Ape Escape, anybody? I joke, but that game is actually fucking awesome. And from the original DualShock controller, the PlayStation layout has remained pretty much the same up until now. It wasn't until the PS4 that the trackpad up here got added, and I'm in the camp that thinks that the trackpad is kind of a gimmick, honestly. It's a bit too far out of the way to be that useful for gaming, you know what I mean? But I don't hate the idea of trackpads on controllers. I mean, fuck, where is it? I mean, we can talk about this guy, but that is not the point of this video. We're here to talk about layouts, not trackpads, goddammit. But what I find interesting is that when you learn the history of Nintendo and Sony working together to create the PlayStation and how the PlayStation evolved into its own thing with Sony, you learn or you realize that this design stems from one of the titans, a monolith of game controllers, potentially one of the best controller designs ever made in video games. The Super Nintendo controller. So yeah, if you look at this and then you look at a PlayStation 1 controller, I mean, the only difference is that they added 2 additional triggers and a set of thighs for you to grip on. And this layout is even stemming from, where is it? Here we go, the NES controller, but you know, obviously more rounded and fitting better in the hands and all that. So you go from this controller to this one, skip ahead a few decades, and then you eventually get to the DualShock, or the DualSense. It's not the DualShock 5, it is the DualSense. It's actually genuinely interesting to see this kind of history throughout video games, and especially with something as, I'll say, unsung as the design language of your controller. But then, someone else enters the ring in the middle of this lineage over here. So, Microsoft. I obviously do not like Microsoft, and there is a heavy amount of anti-Microsoft bias on this channel. I don't hide that. You know, I'm a human being. We all have our own biases. But one thing I will give to Microsoft is that, yeah, they kind of really hit the nail on the head with controller design. The Xbox 360 is the standard of controllers nowadays. And I mean, you can trace that back all the way to the Duke controller. I don't own a Duke controller, unfortunately. One day I will get one, especially that wireless one that works on modern systems. That one would be a fun controller to talk about and a fun one to look at. But even with the Duke, as good as it was, there's still some interesting quirks about it. I mean, the major thing I can think of is that there are only 2 trigger buttons and 6 face buttons. You have the ABXY like you do on the 360 and the modern Xbox controllers, but then you also have the black and white buttons, and those are just like, it's like a 6 face button layout kind of vibe. It feels more like a fight stick than anything. Which honestly, you might be able to trace back some of the lineage of the Duke design all the way back to the Sega Dreamcast controller, and I could go on a huge fucking rant about the Dreamcast controller. That was way ahead of its time. Which you could trace the Dreamcast controller back to the Sega Saturn controller, and ooh, there's a fancy history there. But you see where everything sort of begins, right? You have big companies who are trying to design specific controllers to fit specific needs, and then eventually those designs evolve over time until we get to the relatively homogeneous design language of today, with the only main difference being the placement of the joysticks. And there are tons of controllers that borrow this layout. So, I mean, from Nintendo and from companies like 8BitDo, which, you know, I know I'm a shill, so I'm not going to talk about them that much. And one of the things that is honestly a little disappointing to me about modern controller layouts is the arrangement of the face buttons, especially when it comes to all the different types of controllers. You know, you have the Xbox layout, which is normally the standard for things like PC gaming and modern consoles and all that, but then you have the Nintendo layout, where the ABXY buttons are the exact same placement as they were back on the Super Nintendo controller, and it's even been the same for Nintendo's handhelds. I mean, the Nintendo DS has the ABXY exactly as it was back on the Super Nintendo, so Nintendo has their layout. And I guess for some reason Microsoft just thought it would be better, worse, to flip the buttons in the way that they did. I have no idea why they switched the buttons this way. But that decision, you know, has lasting ripples on what gaming is nowadays. Okay, so I did a bit more research after I initially recorded this video, and I found some more, I'm going to call it historical happenstance, because there's no proof, at least as far as I could find, there was no proof that Microsoft and Sega worked together to develop the original Xbox, because they were competitors at the time, right? The Dreamcast was still, like, being sold at the time the Xbox was being developed. So I'm gonna chalk this up to developers at Microsoft just kind of looking over the shoulder of Sega and kind of copying off their homework for the time being. Okay, so we have the original Xbox Duke right here. It has the A, B, X, Y, and the black and white buttons. So weird fucking layout, right? Okay, so let's go back to the Dreamcast controller. And you'll notice on the Dreamcast controller, there's A, B, X, Y, exactly like it is on the Xbox controller nowadays. They saw this diamond layout, they initially went with this controller layout. So you might think, like, why the fuck? Okay, so if the Duke initially got its controller layout from the Dreamcast controller, if that happens to be true, then why was Sega the first one to switch the buttons around? Well, it's not, they didn't switch it around for no reason. So the Dreamcast controller, pretty sure, comes from the design of the Sega Saturn controller. And look at the fucking Saturn controller, A, B, X, Y, exactly like well, very similarly to how it is on the Dreamcast, right? They just took out the C and the Z button, probably put them on the sides as L and R. So it all stems from the Sega Saturn controller, but where did the Sega Saturn controller come from? It came from the fucking Mega Drive controller. So you had A, B, C, and then later on, Sega releases the fucking 6-button layout, A, B, C, X, Y, Z. They use that later on the fucking Saturn controller. That gets turned into the Dreamcast controller. Xbox copies Sega's homework to make the Xbox controller. They evolve it even further to make it the Xbox 360 controller, and it all just sort of feeds into itself. So the reason we have this great schism of controller layouts all goes back to the fucking Mega Drive, dude. Isn't that fucking crazy? That just like such a minor, like, weird design change all comes from the fact that Sega decided to do a 3-button layout instead of a 2-button layout like Nintendo did back in like 1989 or whatever. Oh man, that's just fucking dude. I just went down like a weird research rabbit hole, and this is what I came up with. So fuck yeah, no, all of this is going into the video. I don't care. Oh my god, I was fucking right. I did more research. Dude, okay. Project leads Jay Allard and Cam Ferrari aimed for a controller with every feature the team liked from the preceding ones. Slots from the Dreamcast controller, 2 sticks from the PlayStation's original DualShock, and 6 frontal buttons from a revised Sega Genesis controller. I was right! They were totally looking over Sega's shoulders when designing their own controllers, dude. And they were looking over everybody else's shoulders to just pick and choose every little thing they wanted from every little controller. And the 6-button layout comes from the fucking Genesis controller. And then guess what? So they had the original Duke controller, and then later on, like, they wanted to sell their consoles in fucking Japan, and they prefer like smaller electronics and shit like that over there. So they took this bloated fat piece of shit known as the Duke, and they slimmed it down into the fucking Xbox controller S. And look at that, it's got the fucking diamond that we have on the modern controllers. Oh, dude, oh man, this is what I fucking love, is just looking at the history, having a theory, and then like doing just a little bit more research, and then you end up being completely fucking right about it. And then like later you can just you see the history of this shit like in real time, dude. That's crazy, bro. So it wasn't Microsoft that switched these buttons around, it was fucking Sega all along. It all leads back to Sega, dude. Holy shit. That's wild, man. But a little tidbit that I realized a few years ago. So Sony is a Japanese company, or at least it used to be a primarily Japanese company before the American branch kind of took everything over. But in Japan, there's an interesting bit of design language in this controller that is still felt today. So in Japan, the circle is commonly referred to as the good sign. You know, here in the States, we have the check mark, right? And then maybe if you were a kid, you had a big old goose egg or a 0 on your report card or your whatever you had in school. But in Japan, it is the X symbol that is used as the wrong answer, so to speak. So on the original PlayStation controllers, you had the same layout as the Nintendo buttons. You have A on the right side and then B on the bottom. And the original design was actually supposed to be the circle was the accept button, the X was supposed to be the back button, and then the square was supposed to be opening maps, and the triangle was supposed to be sort of a first-person, third-person kind of switch button. It was supposed to be like the perspective button, right? And for the life of me, I could not find a reason as to why Nintendo chose X and Y to go along with A and B instead of something like a C and a D button, like with the Sega Genesis controller. That has A, B, and C. So why X and Y? I couldn't find a concrete reason for that, but the theory that I'm just going to go with and parrot in this video, I have no idea if this is correct or not, but it's theorized that X and Y are supposed to be emulating the different planes of a screen when you're designing sprites and designing a game. So you have the X-axis and the Y-axis, and that's also probably why Nintendo chose the Z button on the triggers, which we get to finally talk about my favorite controller, the GameCube controller. Pretty sure this is why they still use the Z button to this day. So you have A, B, X, Y, and Z, and then L and R as the triggers over here. So here's what I'm getting at. I don't mind the sort of diamond layout of face buttons that we have on our controllers today, but honestly, it just feels confusing at times. Here's an example for you. If you're playing a game today, and the game tells you to press the X button, where do you press it? Where do you put your thumb to press the X button? See, if you're playing an Xbox controller, it's here on the right side. If you're playing a Nintendo controller, it's here on the top. If you're playing a PlayStation, it's here on the bottom. And if you're playing a GameCube, the X button is on the right side. So it's like, where do you put your finger to press the X button? It's a fucking toss-up no matter what controller you have. And as someone who switches between a lot of these controllers just for the sake of testing and trying different things out, yeah, it does get confusing after a while. But this is why I like the GameCube's layout of buttons so much. Is the GameCube controller a perfect controller? No, not in the slightest. The D-pad's too small, the C-stick is kind of weird, and it feels like kind of a nipple in your hands. There's no second shoulder button. The analog triggers, while they're a really cool design, very few games actually took advantage of their analog functionality and their dual trigger sort of functionality. And there's no select button, there's only a start button, right? Like, that's kind of weird. But the face button layout, it's genius. Because, like, you're gonna be pressing the A button the most in a lot of these games. So why not focus on the A button being the primary button and have everything else orbit around it? And then on top of that, each button has a distinct shape and a distinct place on the controller. So when you're playing a GameCube game and it flashes on screen, press X, it's going to show this bean-shaped button. And it's going to show it facing to the right. So that tells your brain, hey, if you put your thumb to the right, you can press the button. Same thing if they're showing the Y button. It's all the way up here and it's kind of facing upward. So like, oh, I'm gonna move my thumb up. And you don't need to look down at the controller to understand this. If you're playing any of these three controllers, you gotta look down and be like, oh, where the fuck is the X button again? I kind of forgot. You can just kind of naturally feel out how the buttons are placed based on using the controller after a while and the shape that's presented to you on screen. It's just kind of a shame that we kind of like stepped away from this design language because, like, I don't know, it feels more professional, I guess. One of the common criticisms I see about the GameCube controller is that a lot of people who predominantly grew up with Xbox and PlayStation look at this controller and think, well, that's a Fisher-Price controller. That's for little kids. That's something that me, an adult man, a real person, I can't be caught with this kind of Fisher-Price garbage. Get that shit out of here. But, I don't know, that just feels kind of reductive, you know? I know it's not the only criticism for the GameCube controller. I laid out a bunch of them in this one. It's not perfect, not in the slightest. But just because it's Nintendo and, like, it is kind of colorful and kind of weirdly designed, that automatically makes it bad, I don't think so. There's one controller that kind of stands above everything else in its weirdness, but still being relatively uniform, and its wackiness in how it was designed and the circumstances that led to its design, and I think we're gonna talk about it right now. The Wii U controller. Oh, sorry, this isn't the Wii U controller. Hold on, give me a second. Oh no, the Wii U gamepad. Oh, look at that, you can actually see yourself in the reflection. That's pretty funny. This monolith of a controller is something that has stayed in my brain ever since it released back in 2013, over a decade ago. Just really feel that for a second, you know? This controller is more than a decade old. And the craziest part is that, all things considered, the Wii U gamepad still feels really good in the hands. Like, Obviously, it's not perfect. There's a lot of guff in this controller that nobody really gives a shit about. Like, I'm holding this thing in my hand right now, and I'm just kind of messing with the buttons and pressing things, and yeah, it's not the same as actually playing a real game, but I owned the Wii U since launch, and I have played a lot of games on the Wii U. I mean, as many as any Wii U owner could play at the time. I mean, you know. Again, as much shit as I'll give the Nintendo, every single time they try something new with a controller, there's always something in there that is really cool, and I just wish they could bring back, and I wish would be the standard. You know, with the GameCube controller, it was the face button layout. With the Wii remote, it was the IR pointer and how easy it was to just point at the screen and play games. Like, dude, if you've played Pikmin with the Wii remote, you know how good it can be. The waggle and the, I'm gonna call them gesture controls for the sake of clarity, yeah, I'm kinda glad that we've since moved away from that style of controller, but the IR pointer, man, that was a whole nother thing. And obviously, you know, the Wii U Pro controller has its own, we'll just call it, quirks. Very, very interesting design, and I'm assuming they did this to sort of mirror the layout of the gamepad. And you know what? I don't hate this. I don't hate this layout at all. Especially if you're playing something like a retro game, because like both of your fingers are in a symmetrical style layout where you have your thumb right here on the D-pad and then you have the buttons over here. Like it just, I don't know, it feels, oh god, it feels just kind of like holding a Super Nintendo controller. Now obviously, it's not the same. Your fingers are way closer together than they are in the Super Nintendo controller, and depending on the size of your hands, it's gonna be easier or harder to reach all of these different buttons in these different layouts, right? So someone with smaller hands might not enjoy this layout as much as they would the PlayStation layout over here. Which, I mean, to this day, this is still my favorite layout of controller. Like, I really, really like the layout of the 8BitDo Pro 2, but again, you know, I'm not here to shill. Again, I played the Wii U a lot as a kid, and I played a lot of games with this controller. I even played PC games with this thing, dude. My first time playing Binding of Isaac, the Flash version, all the way back in like 2011, 2012, it was with this thing, passed into my Samsung laptop, passing through fucking Joy-to-Key, and those inputs being transplanted into Binding of Isaac, the Flash game. This was my daily driver, bread and butter controller for games that just did that, because like, you gotta remember, back in 2011, 2012, an Xbox controller, where is it? Hold on, here it is. There's so many controllers on my desk. The Xbox 360 controller didn't natively connect to a Windows PC, or at least a Windows 7 PC. Nah, if you wanted Xbox 360 compatibility on your Windows 7 PC, you had to get their dog shit fucking PC wireless like game receiver thing, and every time you plugged it into a different slot, like a different USB port on your computer, you had to reinstall the drivers specifically for that port so your controls wouldn't work, and then you had to go through the process of reinstalling the drivers every single time. And God forbid if you were in a public location like a LAN party or something and you were having everybody plug in their controllers and having everything connect, and then, uh-oh, wait a minute, I don't know why my controllers aren't working. Oh, hold on, I gotta go into the fucking control panel and reinstall the goddamn drivers for this thing. I hate this fucking thing. I absolutely hated this little wireless dongle over here, but I still keep it just to remind myself of how Microsoft has fucking scorned me over the years. Fuck you, Microsoft. What was I even talking about? Oh yeah, controller layout. Okay, yeah, so the Wii U Pro... So the Wii U Pro controller, like, honestly, I don't mind the layout, but I know a lot of people have, like, I don't know, they recoil when they see this thing. I feel like a lot of that is just because it's different and weird and not exactly what they come to expect from an Xbox controller. Like, that's the interesting thing about human beings, is that if you show them anything even slightly different, there's like this initial like, that's weird and it's different and I don't like it. What the fuck? How? What do you mean the control sticks are on the top? But I mean, like, you know, for the Wii U gamepad, the control sticks being on the top actually feels just fine. And you got these big paddle triggers on the back, and everything just kind of conforms nicely to where your hands would naturally rest on this kind of controller. And it's got like these indents on the bottom where your hands rest, and it's... honestly, the gamepad still feels great in the hands. And you wanna know what's funny? Is that I've got something, you probably have something at home that confirms how good this layout actually was. Let me get it. The Steam Deck. Now, obviously, it's not the same, right? The control sticks are, instead of being kind of here on the outside, they're closer to the inside. And it's actually kind of interesting the way that the B button sort of curves into the natural curves of the Steam Deck shell. I'll get some close-up pictures and I'll throw them up on screen, but yeah, like, the Steam Deck feels great in the hands, and you still have access to trackpads and all the buttons and the sticks and all of this good stuff right here. Steam Deck, I think, is genuinely the closest we've seen to controller perfection. And I'm going to chalk up this design to one of two things. I have my own theories. I'm pretty sure, you know, because Valve loves to beta test and rapidly iterate their designs because that's just kind of how they roll, I think they eventually just landed on this design and it felt good in the hands to everybody that they tried. And they did some, you know, they probably did some like focus group testing, and they had each of them hold different variants and different layouts of the Steam Deck, and they eventually landed on this one because it just felt the best to the most people. But my personal headcanon, and one that I know is completely out of left field and is just absolutely batshit bonkers, is that some designer at Valve saw the Wii U gamepad, played Splatoon back in the day, and thought, yep, this is the design. This is what we're going for when designing our handheld PC gaming juggernaut. But I think we all know that the true evolution of the Wii U gamepad was the Switch and how its interlocking controllers worked, and like, you look at these two and it's like, okay, clearly this evolved into this, right? But even then, the fucking Joy-Cons over here, even if you put them in their Joy-Con grip, it's still got the Xbox layout. Honestly, the Xbox layout does work better for the Joy-Cons because of this. Remember, like, the original pitch of the Switch, haha, funny rhyme, was that you had one console that had two controllers on it. I remember sitting in fucking restaurants and libraries with my friends and my sisters playing snipper clips where I'd pass a Joy-Con to them and we would play the funny fucking paper snip game. Nowadays, this sort of design has really fallen off with the Switch. Like, nobody really cares about it as like a local co-op, local multiplayer kind of machine. And they kind of just use it in tablet mode, really. Or, I mean, honestly, a lot of people just keep them in their docks and never really take the tablet out. But that actually leads me into an interesting one. The Switch Joy-Cons in the Joy-Con grip. Now, obviously, these two are more similar than they are different. They have the same sort of layout with the asymmetrical buttons, but Nintendo did something a little bit weird with the D-pads on these controllers. See, let's start with the Joy-Cons. Here's a big innovation. Well, I don't know about innovation, more like a side grade, a segmented D-pad. In practice, when you're using the Joy-Cons like this, and you're playing with the segmented D-pad in a normal, traditional 2D platformer, it's not great. Now, if you play games with the D-pad where you purposefully hit one corner of the D-pad and you move your thumb back and forth to press the D-pad for movement and stuff, I'm sure that this like segmented D-pad layout works fine for you. But I just don't do that. Like, if I'm playing a game with a D-pad, I place my thumb in the middle and I sort of rock it back and forth to determine where I'm going. But the reason that the segmented D-pad works on the Joy-Cons, and really only the Joy-Cons, is it goes back to this segmented, like, you know, one controller, two players kind of vibe. Because on the inside, you've got your weird L and R buttons, but you can hold either of these Joy-Cons one-on-one and still have a diamond of face buttons, and you can still use them like a simple but relatively modern controller. It's a neat gimmick, but one that, I won't be sad if it goes away. Now, obviously, with the Switch 2 coming out eventually and being fully backwards compatible with the Switch, the new Joy-Cons 2, or whatever they're going to call them, are still going to have this segmented D-pad, and that'll just be how it is laid out. I don't really have any hard feelings one way or the other. The thing that really gets my goat is the Switch Pro Controller's D-pad, in that it's garbage. I don't know what Nintendo did. I don't know why they chose to make this controller, this specific D-pad, so terrible. I don't know what led to this, but on every other controller, not just Nintendo, like, okay, aside from like this garbage fucking Xbox D-pad, but I mean, like, that's Microsoft, you know, they've got their own qualms over here. Nintendo historically has had amazing D-pads, not just on their controllers, but on their handhelds too. Like the Wii U gamepad's D-pad is actually phenomenal. I don't know what happened here, but every single time I try to use this D-pad for 2D games, I always end up misinputting the D-pad. I go to hit right, and it ends up hitting up or down. I go to hit left, same thing, ends up hitting up or down alongside that. You press one side of the D-pad, and even if I were to go all the way down to the bottom and only try to press the one quadrant of the D-pad I really want to hit, if I rock it back and forth just a little bit, sorry, you meant to hit right? You know, you meant to hit down and right at the same time, obviously. You put your thumb right here. Really, that meant you put your thumb right here. That's what you meant, right? Like, ooh, I don't like this controller. This controller, the most frustrating thing is that this is one of the best controllers I've used. The face buttons are nice and wide for me to smack with my big thumbs. The triggers, even though they're digital, they still feel good. They're nice big flaps. The sticks are really nice. It feels weighty in the hand. It's a good controller. It just, ooh, this D-pad. And yeah, that little thing can ultimately make or break a controller for a lot of people, much like how the layout of joysticks can make or break a controller for a lot of other people. You see, we went full circle on this one, huh? I guess at the end of this video, what I really wanted to talk about was just that controllers are really interesting, and I think that there's a lot of rich history to dive into when it comes to the layouts of controllers and how things have evolved over the years, and I hope this little, like, surface level dive, it just sort of piqued your interest a little bit. I think there's a lot that controllers get right today, but I also think there's a lot of room for improvement. You know, we're gonna talk about Valve and all of the weird shit that they're doing at another point in time, because I have a lot to say about the Steam controller, the original, the leaked potential design for the Steam controller 2, which, by the way, if this controller ends up being real, it might just be my forever controller, and the weird, like, innovations that they have that I genuinely feel like are actual, for real innovations, not just gimmicks like this center touchpad or this weird fucking D-pad thing that Microsoft's going on. And I hope that you find this sort of design language in controllers just as interesting as I do. It's actually been kind of weird over the years for me to be friends and interact with people who play games just as much as I do, if not even more than I do sometimes, and how they don't really put any thought into the controller that they use. You know, they just sort of go with whatever's given to them by the big console manufacturers, and that's just good enough for a lot of people. And to be fair, you know, these controllers here are really nice controllers. Like, they feel good in the hands, and they're made with premium materials, and they get the job done for sure, but no gyro aim. No gyro aim on the Xbox controller. That's sad. But I think that's enough for this video. So I think right now, all I want to do is thank the YouTube lads who support this channel directly and just make this wild pipe dream that I have closer to reality than it ever has been. If you want to support this channel and get early ad-free access to every single video I publish, as well as an exclusive behind-the-scenes video for every video I publish, you can go ahead and click down in the description. There's a join button. You can join there. You can see a whole bunch of cool stuff there, and all kinds of whatever. I have a bunch of perks. I don't know. The video down there will explain most of it. You know, do the like, the comment, the subscribe, because those really do help me out a lot more than you'd expect. You know, even the fact that you're here at the end of the video, it actually does mean a lot to me, and that alone helps me out more than you can possibly expect. So, you know, it's cool. It's cool to be able to do this and talk about plastic that really doesn't matter to anybody. So, I'll see you in the next video.